I think the current framework has served consumers extremely well. The focus on higher quality, lower prices, and greater access to goods has really yielded immense benefits and improved the economics of the way people enjoy, the social welfare that people enjoy immensely. Importantly, it made sure that antitrust didn't favor certain competitors. You often see situations where someone complains about a practice and they're saying, that's hurting me as a company, when in fact it led to lower prices for overall consumers or better products. And I understand from the company standpoint why that's important, but there's no reason consumers should have to pay to benefit an individual actor. And that's an important aspect of the current regime. The other thing is it's kept most competition law processes from being politicized, which is another great weakness potentially of how the antitrust can disserve consumers. And I think that the way that the current framework works, focusing on consumer welfare, does that. How could it be improved? Well, I think one way it's already been improved is a shift to empiricism. What you'll find is there used to be a great emphasis on theory. And if it's just theory, anything that's theoretically possible is arguable, and everything is theoretically possible. And so you end up with these sort of open-ended discussions. What I really see is exemplified by the AT&T Time Warner merger, which is we had a theoretical argument and now improved slightly by parameterizing empirically some of the assumptions that went into that argument, went up against a broad-based empirical study that said, let's look at the last 4 mergers that looked like this and see what its impact was on consumers, to see what the overall effect was. And we're finding is that kind of evidence is becoming much more convincing. The other way it could be improved, I think, is a better understanding of innovation. I mean, the mysteries of how the innovative process works and the wellsprings of genius is actually very hard to know. And how to marshal resources and R&D and its relationship has proven very, very thorny. It's been called, the relationship between market structure and innovation has been called the second most studied problem in economics. So it's not for lack of effort. I just think the problem is so complex that we're still in the process of learning how that works. And as we get better about that, we'll be able to help competition law even more. So the U.S. recently updated the vertical merger guidelines in ways that are quite salutary. In fact, the guidelines had not been updated since the 80s. It was reaffirmed in the 90s, and it deviated quite far from practice. And I think it was essential that we update that to reflect current practice, but more importantly, one of the revolutions of the last 50 years has been a better understanding of vertical integration. We understand that, in fact, that the conditions for it to be harmful to consumers are much narrower than we thought 50 years ago. And in fact, there are greater pro-competitive benefits. And consistent with the emphasis I gave on empiricism before, there have been 3 recent surveys by economists who either before or after end up serving on the staff of antitrust enforcement agencies, both parties, so it's not a partisan thing. And they both concluded that in the vast majority of cases, vertical integration is either neutral or beneficial to consumers, and the cases in which it actually harms consumers is vanishingly small. And I'm struck by one of them was co-authored by Francine Lafontaine, who was one of the chief economists, she was one of the chief economists in the Federal Trade Commission during the Obama administration. And she said she was surprised. She didn't expect to find that result. She wasn't gunning to find that result. But she said we should get out of the business of regulating vertical integration so that it bars it from happening. The invocation of public utility regulation really reminds me of George Santayana's famous statement that those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. And what strikes me is historically there's been an enormous fight in the space between what I think of as the bellheads and the netheads, in the sense that there's the old school telecom people who saw the world one way, and there's the progressive internet types. And I think the netheads have had the better of the argument almost all the time. But this is one case where I think the bellheads know something about history that the netheads don't, which was, if you look at the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there was an enormous literature that discovered that utility regulation doesn't work that well. And they were looking for ways to improve it and looking for, frankly, for alternatives because they thought some of them couldn't really be fixed. It's hard to implement, creates economic distortions, which creates welfare losses. It facilitates collusion. It dampens innovation. And in fact, it only plausibly works for commodities. So if something varies in quality, the tools we have to do public utility regulation don't work. So if you're talking about natural gas or water or electricity, they tended to work better. But for things that vary in terms of quality, one of the best examples is the failure of common carriage regulation on cable. What discovered is that the companies, if you cap their prices, they can actually make their profit by degrading the product, by investing less on the cost side. And the irony is rate regulation in cable television, we did an experiment in 84 where we deregulated it. In 92, we re-regulated it. In 96, we deregulated it again. And it was a great natural experiment. And the irony is rate regulation caused quality adjusted prices to increase because they actually degraded the quality even more. And so unless you're going to engage in comprehensive quality regulation, which is frankly as hard as rate regulation is to do, quality regulation is even harder. You'll find that it's not the tool that people think it is, where you just say, oh, we can just do that and do it everywhere and all the time. So I actually think that there are several things we could do to improve the way it's been enforced. One, two I've already mentioned, is a greater emphasis on empiricism and a better understanding of innovation. One thing that the agencies have just started to do, but need to do more, is to bring more technological expertise into the process. Because particularly as we deal with high-tech industries, being able to understand the platforms that they're studying has become amazingly hard. And I think that they need to think about staffing in a fundamentally different way. Second is, I think other authorities outside the US have done a better job doing what we think of as retrospective studies. So we blocked a merger, or we allowed a merger, or we intervened in a certain way, based on predictive judgments of what the likely outcomes would be. Well, how did that actually pan out? It's a wonderful question that's rarely studied and rarely asked. And in fact, it's hard to do because the predictive judgment, it may or may not have panned out because circumstances changed. Because the studies all really assume if everything's, all things being equal. And as we know, things are never completely equal. So actually correcting for all those things and figuring them out can be quite hard. But it's not. That's the normal problem with studying things. That's not a reason not to proceed with those sorts of retrospectives and to try to figure out, how to do things. And the other thing I would say is that I think that it's been really effective on the U.S. regime is that we have a judicial enforcement regime, which requires enforcement officials to prove to an independent decision maker that they've made their case. And what you'll discover is, there's an old principle that goes back to Roman law and the Code of Justinian that no one should be a judge in their own cause. It shows up in English law in something called Bonham's case, which is by Lord Coke. There's a lot of very famous things, but it's also shown up in the European Court of Human Rights in the Menarini decision, where they're saying that unless you have the agency that is simultaneously an enforcement official and the judge has to take off their enforcer hat and put on their judge hat and ask, have I proved my case beyond whatever the evidentiary standard is? And, we all know human nature, that's a really, really hard thing to ask people to do. And the Menarini case itself said, you need plenary judicial review to make this okay. Because otherwise you are violating that principle of having someone being the judge in their own cause. There are deference doctrines on judicial review where we have to be very careful to make sure that every case gets an independent review and make sure that, in fact, I think we should enforce the competition laws where the violations happen. We just have to do it in a procedural manner that instills confidence in the people around it and actually gets to good outcomes. I think the killer acquisition question or the nascent competitor acquisition question is a perfect example to me of the potential ambiguity of theory and the need for a better grounding and understanding what's really going on. So you can tell stories about how acquiring a young company could be eliminating a competitor and hurting future competition. There's another two stories you can tell. One is that the acquisition of the nascent competitor is what made it successful because it's needed to be combined with other assets in order to move forward. The other problem is many startups, their goal when they start up is no longer to go public and to have an IPO as it once was. Many of them regard the ability to be acquired by another company as a major part of their exit strategy and part of what makes their venture valuable. And so you face the prospect, if you do this wrong, of cutting off the value of the potential value of a startup by reducing its value, by limiting the ways that it can actually monetize the investments that it's done. And if that's the case, you only limit them to either building the product themselves and going IPO and becoming, a true unicorn, which is a much higher ask. So the irony is this could actually be extremely harmful to innovation, even though it's intended to benefit consumers or actually to benefit the innovators themselves. A very common example that people point to is Google's acquisition of Android. Now, Android's obviously a tremendously successful product. At the time it was acquired by Google, it had 6 employees and no revenue. And so you'd need a set of rules that would separate the startups that are going to turn into competitors from the ones that are going to be complementary products or smaller innovations that need to be integrated into a larger whole and are best done perhaps by being acquired by a different company. And until we have the tools to separate those two scenarios, blocking nascent competitor acquisitions just as a matter of course risks actually hurting the innovative process, hurting consumers, and hurting the very innovators it's designed to protect. Well, so breakups, from an antitrust standpoint, have been extremely rare and for good reason. It's only there's a handful of very significant ones in the U.S. Standard Oil, American Tobacco, and AT&T immediately leap to mind. But breaking up a company, we're not talking about blocking a merger, but an established company long after it's been formed, is rare because it's extremely expensive and doesn't always create the benefits that we envision. So most of the breakups that are currently under discussion are breakups of what we call vertically integrated businesses, as opposed to horizontal breakups. And the breakups of the vertically integrated businesses, for the reasons I mentioned before, are questionable in terms of the overall economic evidence. The surveys of the peer-reviewed economic literature, and peer review is still the gold standard of how we decide, validity. As I said before, the literature has been shown that vertical integration tends to be beneficial to consumers or neutral, and that the cases in which it's harmful are very, very rare. And this is done by very broad-based people who have excellent reputations, and it's not a partisan slant or a conclusion they're trying to reach. And in that, the idea of breaking them up vertically probably won't yield consumer benefits based on the evidence. Now, in a particular case, if you could show it, I could, with a theory and evidence to back it up, you can try to make the case. But it does really signal that extreme caution should be used. The other thing is, it's not just vertical breakups. As you mentioned, there's line of business restrictions. And if you look at the history, particularly of the AT&T breakup, the line of business restrictions are extremely hard to police, require a lot of judicial oversight. There were these huge backlogs of requests for waivers and modifications that the courts had to deal with. And in a technologically dynamic environment like the ones we have today, that's going to be even harder than it was in the 1980s, because telephone service was relatively sleepy. I mean, you could still to this day plug a telephone into the wall from the early 20th century and it would still work. I mean, the basic principles haven't changed that much. You can't say that today. And so, what I would draw a line from Holmes, who said, "A page of history is worth a volume of logic." What we learn is we have all these great theoretical arguments about how breakups might be beneficial. If you actually look at the historical record and see how these have been done in the past and how structural separation and line of business restrictions have played out in the past, what you discover is there's some really interesting empirical studies that show that has led to billions of dollars of consumer welfare loss. Because it's delayed products or caused them to be implemented in ways that were better done on a vertically integrated basis, that actually was tremendously harmful to consumers in ways that have been studied, econometrically, and provide a very useful guidepost to me of or a caution sign before proceeding down that route. The fact that you're asking me about two agencies points at one of the more curious features of US competition law. Why we have two agencies is largely is explained by path-dependent reasons that no one can really justify. People have been proposing unifying them for years. I could go into that debate now, but at this point, I don't think it's really on the table. It wouldn't really be productive, but just wanted to mention that. It's one of the great curiosities of US competition law. Obviously, the enforcement officials should bring cases where it's warranted and when the evidence supports it. I think everyone understands and agrees with that, so that's not really the question. I think there are a number of other roles the FTC and the DOJ can play. One of the interesting ones, as I've mentioned already, is retrospective studies to try to understand how things have been gone in the past. But one of the more interesting things they can do is what we think of as competition advocacy, which is the competition advocacy group in the antitrust division under Makin Delrahim convened a number of workshops to actually understand problematic areas or difficult to understand areas before they had a case in front of them to try to increase their general understanding of them and the kinds of information that they need. So they held hearings on real estate, on labor markets, which was something that's been relatively understudied. And one that I had the privilege of participating in is the interaction between regulation and competition law. Sometimes they help each other, but there are certain circumstances under which regulation can be anti-competitive. It can actually create entry barriers or raise the costs of different entrants to make it harder for smaller providers or incoming providers, new entrants to survive. And it's a really interesting idea. It suggests that the FCC and the DOJ have a role to show those effects, to actually offer comments and intervene in different decision-making processes. And that applies not only domestically within the US, but internationally as both of those agencies have done over the years from time to time. One of the most interesting experiences I had when I started teaching is I started looking at the trade laws, specifically the anti-dumping laws, and compared them to competition law. And I said to my friend, a scholar who was teaching in both trade and in competition law, I said, this doesn't make any sense. This has nothing to do with good competition principles. And he said, what makes you think trade has anything to do with competition principles? And his point was, it's often hugely political. And in fact, unfortunately, that's the case. Now, what's striking to me is for about the last 60 to 70 years, we've seen a general commitment to bring those principles more in line, which is trade has been largely focused on lowering tariffs, allowing markets to govern more, limiting government intervention in markets and state ownership of enterprises. And it's never been perfect, but through things like the WTO and GATT and regional agreements and bilateral trade negotiations, we've seen a steady commitment and movement towards making trade policy look more like competition law. And it's striking to me how beneficial that has been to consumers. So you mentioned China, as people generally know, during the Trump administration, the US entered into a large trade war with China. That has had lots of winners and losers. Now, obviously, there are some industries, domestic industries in the US who did very well by this, the ones that are being protected. But on the other hand, there are other sectors that have done very badly. The components that incorporate the tariff goods that as inputs have seen their prices to go up. But most importantly, US consumers have seen their prices go up on a whole range of goods across the board. In other words, it's a classic example of we're benefiting a few companies and harming consumers as a whole. And in fact, this is what you lose when you start to build in those sorts of, if you will, competitiveness questions into competition law. And in fact, what you see this is, I actually think that it would be a mistake to build this too much into China. There is an appropriate role for what I think was retaliatory tariffs, because you do have to make things line up. And if you can't do it unilaterally, you do need to do this cooperatively, and that is a means by which we get there. But to me, introducing ideas of competitiveness and industrial policy into competition law is an open invitation to benefit competitors instead of consumers in ways that are inconsistent with competition law. So, the funny thing is, I think that antitrust law has followed a tried and true formula that has really stood the test of time, which is if you're going to bring a case, you need to have a plausible and coherent theory backed by evidence and enforced by a remedy that's actually tailored to the theory and the evidence you provided. It's a troika that has served us really, really well in disciplining the kinds of arguments that people make. And in terms of the economics, it has to be not just theoretically plausible, but people have to have the incentive to do it. And in fact, it has to have an adverse effect on welfare instead of a beneficial effect on welfare, all of which has to be shown empirically in ways I think are very important. I think that's had a tremendously disciplining effect on antitrust law that's been hugely beneficial. Because a lot of times you see somebody who does a practice and an actor and says, that doesn't seem right to me, or that raises some concerns. But unless you really make them articulate it, you can actually do a lot of harm. And in fact, making sure that we think through things is important for rule of law purposes, it's important for fairness to the parties, but actually to me, most importantly, it's important for consumers because a lot of us can tell stories or find specific examples of ways that were particularly harmful, but until we actually know the net effect in a more systematic way, intervention could actually be disserving the very people that competition law is intended to benefit.